Hey guys, so in this video we're going to start building the underlying mechanical skeleton, and we're going to start with a few different joints. So we're going to have a hinge joint, which is going to be useful for things like the knee that can only bend in one direction, a ball and socket joint for things like the hip and the wrist, and then also some swivel joints for the neck. So here's the swivel joint, which can rotate in two directions like this, the ball and socket joint, which can rotate in any direction, and then finally the hinge joint. The first joint I'm going to make is the hinge joint for the fingers and the knee. So I'll start by adding a cylinder. And we need to give it some additional vertices. So I'll change this from 32 to 64. Just means we don't need to use a subdivision modifier, which will make modelling a little bit easier. So I'm going to scale this down. We go into isolation mode. I'm going to rotate it on the y-axis by 90 degrees, apply the scale, then we can start modelling. So into edit mode, make sure you turn off proportional editing, Control R to add some loops, and then we're going to scale these on the world X, so SX, and those outwards. And while we're at it, we'll turn on the transformation gizmo, so we can see what the current transformation is set to. I'm going to change it from global to local. I'm going to select the outside parts and then extrude those by Alt-E and extrude along face normals. Push forward on the mouse, will extrude outwards, pull back, will extrude inwards, somewhere about there. I'll select the inside part and I'll separate these by P, separate by selection, and now we've got two models, the outside part and the inside part. On the outside part, just to make it a little bit easier, I'm going to add a mirror modifier. And based on the local axis I want to mirror, I'm going to set this to be the Z axis, so it matches what's shown in the local coordinates on this transform gizmo. I want to turn on bisect so that it cuts the mesh across the central point. Go into edit mode now, interface mode. I'll just do a few extrusions and insets. So E to extrude, push it in, and you can see it's actually disappeared. This indicates I need to flip the axis, and now we should see it on both sides. I'm going to do a few insets and extrusions just to add a bit of interest. We'll add a bevel as well. I then want to add the parts that are going to stick into the model, so they go inside the fingers or legs. So we're going to front orthographic. I'm going to select either side of this central point some faces. I'll go with 2, and then I'll skip 4, and we'll go with 2. So we've got 2, 4 deselected, then 2. Do the same on the bottom. And then if we extrude these out, so if we go into side view, just so we can make sure they extrude perfectly in line with the local y-axis, E. And I want these to be flat on the end. If I try and flatten these out on the y-axis, so SY0, you'll see they go inside the model. So escape on that. And this is because we're still using the 3D cursor as the pivot point. So press full stop on the keyboard and we'll change it from 3D cursor to medium point, and then S, Y0. Then it will flatten those out based on the current local coordinates. I'd like to add some cross sections as well. So I'm going to go into side view, orthographic. And what I'd like to do is cut all the way through these models to create the different areas for the cross section. Now, what I could do is I could do Control R and do it this way. But this means we've got to do it on each single one individually, one at a time. And it's also going to cause these to be not quite straight as I would like them. So instead of doing it this way, I'm going to press K on the keyboard. I'm going to cut through. So I'll left click, drag. If I want it to be constrained to an axis, in this case the X axis is pointing straight down, I'll press X. Now it's constrained. If I want it to cut through the object all the way through, you can see that at the bottom here we've got the option to cut through by pressing C. So if I press C, you can see this now says on. So I'll left click to finish that. I'll right click to continue cutting, and I'll add one here and one here. When I've finished, right click and enter, and this will add it into the model. So I probably want to slide these along a bit in actual fact. So I go into edge mode. I'm going to alt click on this loop, and this loop. I'm going to slide these by pressing G twice. If I slide to the right, they'll retain the 90-degree angle, but if I slide to the left, you'll see they start taking on the shape of the edges on the left-hand side. If I don't want that to happen, I can press E for an even cut, and I can choose which side I use by pressing F. So you see, even if I slide all the way to the right now, it retains the shape of the edges to the left of the cut. So I'll press F again to flip it. I'll put them about here. And I'm just going to move these ones across now. So I'll go into vertex mode, press Z, X-ray mode, make sure I select all the way through. I'm just going to move these to the left a little bit. And maybe I'll scale those away from each other by SY. So scale and then choose Y as the axis to scale on. Number 2, B, I'll deselect these by pressing middle mouse button down. I'm going to do Control B this time. I'm going to make a bevel. And this is going to be the cross section. I've used the mouse wheel there to reduce the number of segments. I'm probably going to have the cross section about this size. And then I'll go into face mode. The top view will turn on X-ray mode. So we can see all the way through. I only want to have these sides, the sides here selected. So I'll press B and use the middle mouse wheel again, held down to deselect those ones. Just undo that. Make sure you're in face mode first. And that will leave us just with these ones on this side selected. So I'll extrude these. Come out of edit mode, you can see we've got a perfect result. The next part I'd like to do is the inside part. So into edit mode, Control R, we'll add 6 loops, and then number 3 for face mode, and I'm going to select this one, this one, this one, and I think I'll extrude these along the normal, so Alt-E to bring up the extrude menu, and I'll pull back this time to extrude inwards, and then I'm going to go into the back view in orthographic, and then I'll select the bits I want to stick out, making sure that I've got an even selection either side of that X origin line that we can see in the middle there. That just ensures that the extrusion will follow the local X axis. And if I extrude these out again, let's go into side view just to make sure they're both on the Y axis. And we can move these like so. On these ones, I won't bother doing a cross section, and I'm not too fussed about flattening them out either. So what I'd like to do now is add some bevel to this model. And to do that, I'm going to come out of edit mode, and I'm going to select this on its own and isolate it. And you can see we've got a hole in each side of this model. Now if I try and do a bevel, when it gets to this point here, this edge, just bring on a wireframe, because there's nothing to bevel when it gets to here, it's going to sort of be a very strange bevel along this edge. It'll be wide at this point, and then it'll become all skew-whiffed as it comes to this point just here. So to avoid that, we'll go into edit mode, and we'll select all the faces, select loops, and we'll say select the boundary loop. That will select all the holes, all the edges around the holes in the model. I'll press F to fill them in, and then we'll press I to inset them slightly. And now when I do a bevel, we should get a nice result. So let's select this edge, which is on a 90-degree angle. We'll press Shift-G, and I'll say select all edges that share a similar face angle either side of the edge. And that will select all those. There's a few items that are a few edges I would like to bevel that aren't selected, such as this one here. So I'll just increase the threshold until that's included. I'll zoom out and just make sure everything's selected that I want to bevel, which it appears to be. And we'll press Control B, and I'll give it a few segments by using the mouse scroll wheel. If I come out of edit mode, right click and choose Shade Auto Smooth. Or again, in Blender 4, we'll add the Smooth by Angle modifier instead. Does the same thing, from right click, Shade Smooth. You see we're getting this little diagonal shading artifact in the corner, which even if I turn up the smoothing, the normal angle in the auto smooth, it's not going to get rid of it. We're still going to get a sort of a visible triangle in that corner, which I don't like. So I'm going to undo this and get rid of the bevel. What we can do instead is Control B, We'll bevel it again. Well, this time, on the redo panel, so F9, the mitre outer to be an arc instead of sharp. And this will give us this sort of result here. Now, if we come out of edit mode, right click, shade auto smooth again. It looks better, but we started introducing artifacts now in the corners here, as you can see. To fix this, we'll go into the modifier panel and we'll add a weighted normal modifier. And that will do its best to get rid of any of those shading artifacts, which is done quite nicely here. So let's move on to the other part. Isolate this one and into edit mode. I'll select this edge, Shift G, and then choose all edges that share a similar face angle. And we'll check we've got everything we need, which we have because it's using the same threshold as we used last time. I don't want these edges here, but I'm not too worried. We can fix that in a second. We'll do Control B to get this sort of an effect. And then we need to get rid of the bevel where the mirror crosses over in the middle. We can select these vertices and then move them on the Z-axis beyond the mirror plane so that they're not included in the final result. And if we go right click, Shade Smooth Auto, or in Blender 4, Shade Smooth and then Smooth Biangle Modifier, you'll notice we are getting these issues again, which we can probably fix just by adding a weighted normal modifier again. Let's go into the geometry data. You can see there's no custom normals in there just yet. So if you want to export this model into a third-party application and keep the normals, then you need to apply the weighted normal modifier by hovering over this and pressing Ctrl A. And then if we go back into the data panel, you can see we've now got custom normals stored in the mesh, which means that they will be exported with the FBX file or the OBJ file or whatever that you're using to take the mesh into a third-party application. And very importantly, when you do that, make sure you apply the modifiers from top to bottom. If you leave the mirror modifier there, I'll just show you again. If I apply this, Ctrl A, you'll notice we get sort of artifacts showing, shading artifacts. That's because we didn't apply the mirror modifier first. So if I undo that, we can either apply them in order, so Ctrl A, and then we get the correct shading. Or we just undo that. We can also right-click and choose to convert to a mesh, and this will automatically apply all the modifiers in the correct order so that we get the right result. So I'm going to undo all this, get back to the point we've just made the bevel. If I don't want to use the weighted normal modifier, for whatever reason, if it's not producing a very good result, there is an alternative way. We can press Ctrl I, just make sure you're in face mode first by pressing number 3. Ctrl I to invert our selection. So we've got the faces other than the bevel. And this time, rather than using weighted normal, I'm going to sharpen all of these edges, select loops, select boundary loops. You can see it's selected all those edges now. Just make sure we've got all of them selected around the bevel. And I'll do right click and I'll say mark sharp. So now we'll come out of edit mode, right click, shade smooth auto. We don't get those artifacts. But for me, that transition is a little bit too harsh. So there is a third way we can do it. So let's just undo again, back to the point where we had the selection we wanted. We'll do I. And we'll just create a very slight inset around that bevel on all the faces. So all the faces that are selected, all the face islands, will be inset very slightly. And if we now go out of edit mode, right click, shade smooth auto, this time we're getting a bit of a softer transition from that edge there. And if we get a little bit of a shading artifact here, we can go into the data panel and just turn up the auto smooth until that disappears. Or again, in Blender 4, we use the smooth biangle modifier. And if we take a look at the complete model, it should be looking something like this. So for the rest of the modelling, I'll go a little bit faster, but anything we've not covered yet, I'll slow down for. So we'll start by coming out of edit mode. I'm going to do the ball and socket next, so Shift A, and we'll add a UV sphere. And before I do anything else, I want to increase the segments to 64 and the rings to 32, just to give us more resolution so that we don't need to use the subdivision modifier, just to keep things simple. And then we'll go into isolation mode. We'll scale it down a bit. It's not too important to be exact at this point, just to get a rough idea. And then Control A to apply the scale into edit mode, number 1, and Control plus, or Control 3, maybe one more. And I'm going to extrude these up. This is the ball joint. And then for the socket, I'm going to select all of these ones here. So let's select these initially. Control I. Make sure we've not got this top part selected either. And Control minus to bring this down somewhere, probably maybe about here. About there. We'll do Shift D to duplicate, P to separate as a selection, and now we've got two separate objects. So let's take this one, go into edit mode, select all the faces, make sure in face mode, and I'll do Alt T and extrude those along the normals. And then I'll go into bottom view by pressing Control 7, number 5. So we'll make a selection, we'll go this one, and maybe this one, and then we'll do Control Shift plus, and this will extend the selection in a logical order. Maybe we can make these a little bit wider by pressing Control plus without the shift this time. And then we'll extrude these like so. Control R, I'll just add a few of these, number 3, and then we'll select all the way up. And maybe just something very simple like extrude these inwards a little bit. And number 2, select this edge, Shift G, select by face angle, Control B to bevel, and we can use the shift here to make it less sensitive to mouse movement for fine tuning. Come back out, right click, Shade Smooth Auto, same on this one, Shade Smooth Auto. But this time, if you're using Blender 4, don't add the Shade by Angle modifier. We'll do it a little bit differently, but I think first, probably give it a bit of a bevel on this one, bottom one as well. So again, Shift G, face angles, Control B, and we'll give these a bit of a bevel. Making sure that we change the mitre outer back to sharp. If we leave it as arc, we're going to get not as good results when we do the shading. So change this back to sharp. And to get the smoothing set up in Blender 4 this time, we'll use the destructive method. So we'll come back out of edit mode into object mode, and we can do right click and use the shade smooth by angle. This is fine, it's destructive, it's going to mark all the sharps on the object for us, but because we've finished modelling, it's fine. We don't need it to continually update using the smooth by angle modifier. So right click, shade smooth by angle, and then we can set the angle down at the bottom left here, or in the F9 panel if you prefer, and then you can basically get the smoothing exactly as you want. And if you get any artifacts on there, you can add the weighted normal modifier again, right click, and then convert to a mesh to apply that into the actual geometry data down at the bottom there. So we've got the custom split normals burnt into the object, which is fine. And we can do the same for the top one, right click, and you don't need to use necessarily the shade smooth by angle all the time because we've got sufficient geometry on here. Go into edit mode on this top part. All of those sharp edges have actually been beveled, so the bevel itself is going to control the shading. So if I come out of there, right click, and just use shade smooth, it's going to smooth everything, and the geometry itself will control the shading. So let's come out of isolation mode, and then we'll start working on the swivel joints for the neck. And I'll just quickly tidy up the scene by moving these individual parts into their own collections in the outliner, and then disable those collections to hide them. With that done, let's make a start on the swivel joint. So mesh, we'll do a cylinder again, and I'll make it 64 vertices, scale it down a bit, apply the scale, and we'll go into isolation mode. So it's going to rotate this way, and it's also going to rotate this way. So we'll add a second piece, Shift DZ, move this up, rotate it by 90 degrees on the Y-axis, and this will be for the alternative rotation. I'll take the bottom piece into edit mode, number 3, inset it, extrude it down, inset it a little bit more. I'm going to separate this, Shift D, so we've got 2 pieces, and then press P to separate by selection. Back into object mode and select that bottom piece and then the top piece. And with both selected, we'll come out of isolation view and then back in, so we've only got those visible. And let's select this one, number 3, to set the faces, extrude it upwards, and push it through there. It would be nice to have a bevel along this piece here, just so it's a high quality looking model. Now, at the moment, we've got a piece inside, so we can't actually bevel around this edge, because it's not actually an edge that's shared by both pieces of the geometry. What we can do is boolean these together. So if we go into the edit menu, preferences, just make sure you've got the bool tool installed. So it comes with Blender, and it just makes booleans easier to do. And you can see if we scroll down, we've got the union, Control-Shift, Numpad plus. So come out of edit mode, select both models, Control-Shift, Numpad plus, and now they're combined into a single object with no internal geometry. But the problem is we still can't do a very good bevel, because if we try to do that in edit mode, let's just go into Q, select loops, and then select boundary loops. And now try a bevel, Control B. It will work. If we come out of edit mode and go into shade smooth, it's going to look awful. We've got all these artifacts all over the place. So let's just undo that, and we'll look at 3 different ways we can do this. So the first way we'll do it is using the quad remesher. So let's go back into object mode, and I'll just give it, I'll say 3000 quads, should be fine, and then click remesh. And then straight away, we've got a nice topology, which will allow us, in edit mode, to select this edge and bevel it, and give it a few segments, come back out, and then if we turn shade smooth on, we're getting a perfect result. Next, we'll do it without using the quad remesher, but before we do that, let's just quickly tidy up the scene. We'll rename these and put them in a container. Then we'll reuse that original bottom piece, so select that and then go into isolation mode, interface mode, number 3, and we'll separate this by duplicating it, and then P to separate by selection. Then back in object mode, we'll select that new piece, Shift A, and I want to add a cylinder. Make sure it's got 64 vertices. Scale it down, rotate it on the y-axis by 90, GZ to move it up. And now I'll make sure I apply the scale. We'll select 2 new pieces, and we'll isolate those on their own. I want to just modify this to make it a bit more interesting. So number 3, select that face, this face, Control B to bevel, give it a few subdivisions, back out of edit mode, and very importantly, turn on Shade Auto Smooth, or the Smooth Biangle modifier in Blender 4. We'll rename this to be called V2 Normals. I'll now duplicate it, and I'll name this one V2. Come out of full screen mode, I'm just going to hide the normals one. So we're only looking at V2, this one. And I'm going to project this circle onto this mesh. I'm going to go into Control 7, into bottom view, and make sure we're in orthographic. And just so we've got a guide for the bevel area, I'm going to duplicate this part and then scale it up very slightly. And I'm going to select this model, into edit mode, and then Control click on the big circle, back into orthographic because it's going to project it based on the view. We'll do F3, type in knife, and choose knife project. You can see that's projected that shape, that perfect circle, onto this object. So back out of edit mode, I'll get rid of this big circle now. We'll keep this one for reference, the smaller one. Go back into Control 7, into bottom view, select this object. I want to insert these now. So I to insert, just a very slight amount, and then scale it so that we don't get any distortion until it's about the same size as the reference geometry. We'll delete this one now, so we've got the right size. We'll go back into edit mode on this one. I'm going to E to extrude this up on the Z-axis. And I'll just flatten the top with SZ0. Let's just delete all those faces. To avoid any shading issues, we need to spread out these vertical edges evenly. For example, if I come out of here, you can see we've got really sharp lines where those edges are just too close together. So we'll select the top edge loop and delete it, and then we'll select the edge loop down here, making sure you've got the Loop Tools add-on installed. So if not, just install this. Right click, Loop Tools, and I'm just going to say space to space those evenly. E to extrude on the Z-axis. Number 2, select this bottom one, Control B, and we can bevel that now. Select the top loop, SZ0, fill it in and bevel it. If we come back out, we've got a pretty good result, but we've got a few shading artifacts here. So all we'll do is add a data transfer modifier. This basically allows us to take some form of data from a different object, in this case the normals, so we get decent smoothing. And we need to transfer the normals from the original V2 normals onto this one. The normals are stored in the face corner data, so tick that one and click on Custom Normals. Choose the model we want, V2 normals, to transfer from, and we'll change the mapping mode for the best results to projected face interpolated. It's fixed the problems on this part of the mesh, but it's also applied those same normals to this part, which we don't want. So into edit mode, Control plus, until we get down to here. We'll create a vertex group and just call this Don't Smooth. Assign the selection to it. Go back into the modifier and we'll say only apply this to the Don't Smooth group and invert that. And now it's only going to be affecting this part down here. And if we look at the matte cap, a shiny matte cap, we're getting excellent results. All the normals are perfect, even though the topology is absolutely awful. So version 3 is pretty much identical to this one, but we'll do it very quickly. Let's just tidy this up a little bit. We'll hide V2 normals and bring this one back up. Shift D, and I'll call this one F2, we'll call it V3. We'll hide V2 normals again. And on this one, I'm going to do Control R. I'll add 8 cuts. I'll go into the bottom view, Control 7, interface mode, and I'll just select some faces evenly along the model. I'll do right click, Loop Tools, Circle. But we can fix that by shrink wrapping this object to the original normals again, using a shrink wrap modifier, and this will get back that smooth shape by making it conform to the surface of the other object, the original one. So we'll select the target object as V2 normals, the original mesh, change it to target normal object, and then turn on the on cage button so we can see the result in edit mode, and then I to inset, and then S to scale it in a little bit. That gives us a nice little border of quads. Then we'll give it a slight inset and scale it in again. And this gives us an area to bevel. We'll apply the shrink wrap now. Control A, and then out of edit mode first, Control A, back into edit mode. We'll do E to extrude that up, SZ0. And what's happened here is that we've extruded not along the world Z-axis, so that when we flattened it along the world Z-axis, it looks skew width. So change the orientation to normals. So the transform orientation is the average of all the selected faces. SZ0, and that will flatten it correctly. Press F to fill it in, and then give it a bevel with Control B. Do Control plus, and we'll create a new vertex group, and we'll call this one Don't Smooth, and then we'll assign the selection to that vertex group. Number 2, select this one, Control B. Out of edit mode, we're getting a really good result even without doing any smoothing, but we'll do it just to be safe. We'll go into adding a data transfer modifier. Select the normals as the V2 normals as the source, face corner data, custom normals, projected face interpolated, and we'll limit it to use the inverse of Don't Smooth, so just the bottom part. And there we go. So that's the third way we can do it. Now these end caps aren't quads, so we can't use a subdivision modifier on this model. So if you just go into edit mode, you can see that we've got one big face on the side with lots of vertices around the edge. Now this is ideal for this model because we want to be able to extrude and inset that area. But in future, just for future reference, if you ever did want to change a face like this into quads, you can choose the face, delete it, and then I'll select the edge loop all the way around. I'll do Control F, and I'll say grid fill. And that's going to fill it in with quads. We can then do the same for the other two n-gons, and then we're able to use a subdivision modifier. So Control 1, that's given us a subdivision modifier. If we turn off the optimal display and go into wireframe, you can see we're getting all quads still. One thing to bear in mind, and incredibly importantly, is any method that uses a data transfer modifier or a shrink wrap modifier, you must make sure before you move these, see what happens if I move that now, because it's taking this information from this V2 normals, it's going to mess up. So just make sure you apply the modifier before you move it, and that will make sure that all those normals are embedded into the geometry in the geometry data, custom split normal data. I'm going to go with V2, so I'll just tidy up the outliner and move everything where it needs to be. Now I'll set these back into isolation mode, and I'll just finish off this top part. So number 3, select this one, and this one, and inset those, Alt-T, extrude them along the normals, and then I to inset again, about there, Alt-T, push them back out on the normals, to about here, and then Alt-E again, and then number 7, 5, and now I'm going to make a selection either side that I'm going to extrude outwards to be sort of a arm. So we're going to side orthographic with number 3 and then number 5, and now if we extrude, it should be completely in line. And now I want to separate these side parts into their own model, so I'll just select these inside edges by going into wireframe and then just alt clicking on the inside edge on each side. Select loops, loop inner region. I want to separate these as a separate object, so P selection, and now we've got 2 objects. And then for the top part, we'll select these top faces, then we'll press Shift S and choose cursor to selected to put the 3D cursor in the middle of the selection. And then while still in edit mode, we'll add a cylinder and put that in place, rotate it around, scale it down, and just make a few modifications to it to make it look more like a actual rolling thing, I believe is the technical term. Then we'll turn on Auto Smooth or Smooth Biangle Modifier in Blender 4. We'll choose a corner edge that we're going to want to bevel, and then Shift G to select all edges with similar face angles, so we can bevel them all at once. And I've run into a problem here where it's made a bit of a strange selection. And even if I tweak the threshold to try and get the selection how I wanted it, it's still not working. And if you come across this, the most likely cause is that you've got double vertices in one place. So to fix it, all you've got to do is select all the vertices and then just press M and merge by distance. And make sure it's a really low distance so that you don't accidentally merge anything that you don't want to. Then when we try and make the automatic selection again, it should work and we can continue on to do the bevel. So you've got a bit of an issue happening here, so let's just undo this bevel. The best way to fix this, I'm going to select this face and this face. I'm going to Shift G, I'm going to say select coplanar, and then I'll press F to fill all those into one face each. And now when I do a bevel, we should get a decent result. Face angles, Control B. We should be able to avoid that issue just here. Looking good. And then for this one, change Smooth Auto, or the Smooth Biangle Modifier, again in Blender 4. And then I'll just try and make it look a bit cooler by adding some extrusions, loops, and insets. So use the same tools to make yours look cool, however you want. It doesn't have to be identical to mine. I think that looks pretty good. So let's move on to the next part where we're going to assemble all of these pieces into a really cool looking skeleton.